So what did Wickerts contend about sub-Saharan African IQ, and what did Lynn contend, and how did that debate play out?
Yeah, so Jelte Wickert, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly,
I wouldn't, yes. That's why I stuck with the last name.
is a Dutch researcher who's a very serious researcher. He's, as far as I'm aware, not an activist of any kind, and he's done some serious work in psychometrics, that gives him a lot of credibility to comment on these issues. And he and his colleagues published a series of papers in 2010, um, criticizing heavily Lynn's national IQ estimates for sub-Saharan Africa. They published a paper in which they came up with their own estimate of the average IQ of sub-Saharan Africa, which was around 80 or even higher. It may have been 82. Uh, the exact estimate depended on the exact paper because there were four or five papers that they published. But they were suggesting that he'd underestimated the average IQ of sub-Saharan Africa by at least 10 IQ points, which is non-trivial.
Yes.
And so one of the pieces of evidence that he and his colleagues brought to bear was that when they compiled their preferred uh, database of samples for sub-Saharan Africa, it yielded a much higher average. So you might ask, well, how can Lynn's database yield one estimate and Wickert's and colleagues' database yield a very different estimate? Well, it had to do with the exact samples that were included. Uh, as the debate unfolded between these two groups of researchers in the pages of several different academic journals, it emerged that Lynn rejected many of the samples that Wickert's had included on the basis that they were too elite and too unrepresentative. For example, they comprised students at fee-paying schools in various African countries. Now, Wickert countered that Lynn
Right.
had
And just
included, excuse
to
me.
interject, this criticism, this would be, if you tried to estimate, say, the IQ of Pennsylvania in the United States, and your sample consisted almost exclusively of Penn students, this would be a significant problem
Yeah,
because they're much more intelligent than the average person in the population of Pennsylvania.
yeah, sorry, I should have spelt that out. Yeah, so Lynn's objection to including all of these samples was that they were too elite and therefore would lead to overestimation of the average IQ on the basis that groups like, for example, students in fee-paying schools are in no way representative. However, Wickert's countered that Lynn had included in his own database some quite unrepresentative samples that may indeed have yielded too low estimates
Right.
for national IQ. For example, there was in the early, especially in the earlier versions of the database, there were some, quite questionable samples, such as, orphans, if I remember correctly. Like a group of orphans is very unlikely to be representative of the population
Right.
and more likely to underestimate the average.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting just at this point, when we're thinking about representative samples, we don't think it would be that difficult because in Western societies, it is, I mean, it's still a challenge, actually. Sometimes you have to pay significant amounts of money to get a representative sample, but it can be done. It's much harder in sub-Saharan Africa, where you don't have functional governments, or at least if you do, they're very corrupt often, etc.
Exactly. And as the debate has proceeded ever since the exchange of papers in 2010 between Lynn and his colleagues and Wickett and his colleagues, that point has become ever more evident. Um, People say like, oh well, Lynn, we should just throw Lynn's estimates out because he included some rather questionable and most likely biased samples. But you don't throw out data simply because there's some bias. The question is it too severe to allow any meaningful conclusions to be drawn or to
Right.
allow accurate conclusions to be drawn? And there are some samples in the database from sub-Saharan Africa which are pretty decent, but there aren't many. Um, and as you say, this it, it's not it's not necessarily Lynn's fault that it's hard to get very high quality samples from sub-Saharan Africa. That's a general problem afflicting social science studies in that part of the world.
Yes.
As I noted in the article, Garrett Jones, who's a researcher, an economist who's made a lot of use of the National IQ database in his excellent book Hive Mind, for example, he says the reliability of national IQ data for sub-Saharan Africa is about the same as the reliability of GDP data for sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
I give a couple of examples that in my article that I found in another recent article by someone else, where sub-Saharan African countries had reported dramatically higher estimates for their GDP, after only 1 year. So
Right. But
revisions to the tune of like 60% increases. This suggests that the original measurements or the subsequent measurements were very wrong.